It's a great honor to be here, and I, like everyone else, I just appreciate the planning committee and all the effort that went into this. This is magical. And I got started working on men's issues probably, I think my first effort was when I had a son in 1970, and I realized that I didn't know anything about being a dad, and I was scared. And I sort of took care of myself because I was a budding sociologist at the time. And so I said, I don't think I'm ready to be a dad. Maybe he could call me Robert. And so my 40-year-old now has this relationship with me as Robert. And when he was in elementary school, his friends would say, "Isn't he your dad?" And he'd say, "Yeah. How do you know? You call him Robert." And I thought, well, that's a way we change the paradigm, isn't it? We rethink all those relationships. At this stage in my life, it's just a delight, actually. All three of the young people who I have been parented for call me Robert, and I like it. And I like it because it reminds me of feminism and how much it has done for us lately. I was reminded of it when I was thinking about my two little stories before I get into my slides. But one is when I was thinking about the talk today and some sort of magical moments that made sense to me, that something was said and something happened. But I know that the first one probably was in 1970 when I became a dad, and I was aware that feminism told me that we could shift the way we did things, that nothing was true, that everything was up for grabs and negotiable. It was just whether or not we were brave enough to negotiate. The second was listening to Gloria Steinem talk a number of years ago, maybe 30, 25 years ago now, at a conference at Stony Brook in New York. And she was critiquing sort of the standard male history. And a lot of work was being done at that time by feminist historians and anthropologists and archaeologists, sort of rewriting much of the male history that we had learned. And one of the people in the audience said to her, "Well, Ms. Steinem, aren't you worried that maybe these feminist scholars don't have it right?" And she said, "Who cares? We just need a new history." And we don't really care so much about where it comes from because the old history isn't right either. And if we get scared that we're not going to get it right while we're in the process of making change, then we're never going to make the steps necessary, take the efforts to really get change to come about. So I was thinking about that when John was talking earlier about, and I think Steve was talking about it this morning as well, that we grapple with whether or not there's masculinity, whether we know this construct, whether we are really locked into the meaning of it well enough to be able to study it. Let's go. And I think we just need to do it. And as we do the work that needs to be done, we're going to find the answers that are out there for us. And we're sloppy. We're learning how to do this stuff. It's still a new movement. The whole gender movement is a new movement. Even though it's been around as an academic discipline for 40, 50 years now, we're still babes in the woods. And I think we have many, many paths to go down and many discoveries to make and some apologies to be made along the way for what we used to think. The second little story is from my mother, actually, when she was finding out that I was starting to study gender. And she was thinking, why do you do that? And then I went on to study sex, which she was really fascinated with, and said, I didn't know you could study that stuff. But she was thinking about gender. She said, well, I was thinking about when I was a girl in Catholic school, and the nuns told us that we couldn't play sports. And my current wife, Betsy Crane, who will be here tomorrow actually, said, oh, when I was in school, some years later, in the 1950s and in the 60s, we were allowed to play half-court basketball. My mother's generation, no sports. Betsy's generation, half-court. My daughter now plays, of course, for full-court basketball. Isn't that cool? But I asked my mother, what did the nuns say to you about why you couldn't play full-court basketball or any basketball or any sports and don't run? She said, they told us our ovaries might fall out. I thought there was no data. I've been to 1,000 basketball games with women playing basketball because of my daughter, and I have never seen an ovary on the floor in my entire lifetime. I don't know if there's an historical ovary that I don't know about, but maybe that happened at one time. But if you really think about it, Shouldn't we be more concerned about whether those testicles are going to collapse and just break off and go bouncing across the floor? It's the myths that we live with, the stories that we tell that are just so remarkable. So I'm really interested in all this stuff, and I have been for a bit of time. I'm interested right now in sort of masculinities and the intersection between masculinity and sexuality, and gender and sexuality in a broader term. But I'm interested in sort of men who get it. And I'm interested in how that comes about. And I was listening to some of the comments this morning from some of the presenters saying, isn't it about time we had positive stories about men? Isn't it time that we stopped sort of saying men are X, Y, and Z? And I think that we are at a point in our development as a discipline to say that we don't know what we used to think we know. We know that that masculinity, that men's lives are multidimensional. We know that masculinity itself is multivariable. We know that it changes and flows and ebbs with time and distance and space and situation and context, with age, with income, with race. There's no limit to the variations of what a man is. And even the term masculinity itself, I notice we don't have femininity studies, for instance, but we still hang on to masculinity. And I think women's studies has let go of femininity and talked about women's lives. We hold on to masculinity, I think, because it's such a strong construct in patriarchal cultures. It's been so precious for so long and so important for so long that it's hard for us to even walk away from it or to come up with another framing. So we hang out with it, and I can live with that for a while. But I'm also interested in us really challenging ways in which we can express masculinity studies in new and innovative ways. So what I want to talk about with some slides in my background today is sort of some stuff I've been thinking about around crossing borders. I'm interested in men who get it. I'm interested in males who cross borders and move from the center and engage the margins. And I think about that in my current research, actually, as a qualitative researcher, around men who are straight identified and who get it around feminism, as well as who get it around sexual orientation and homosexuality. And I'll talk about that more elaborately in a second. But I'm interested that in the 30 years or so that I've been involved in men's studies or men's work, running programs in Anchorage, Alaska in 1977, I think, I was involved in starting the first program for batterers for men who perpetrated violence against women. And the 2 points of that story was when we opened the first shelter in Alaska, we, of course, naively thought we would get a shelter, get state funding, open a shelter for battered women that was going to house at least 12 women and their children. And we thought we had just died and went to heaven in terms of, wow, that's a huge building. And within 2 months, we had an overflow of women and children, and we had an overflow within 2 years to the point that we had to get state funds to build a 40-person shelter. The first woman in that shelter was a 70-year-old woman who, when the intake worker asked her what her story was, she said, my husband's been battering me for 50 years of our marriage, and I didn't know it was okay. It wasn't okay until I read the article in the paper that said it wasn't okay. And I thought, how important can that be in terms of somebody putting out the message that there's something on the menu that they didn't know about and a different way of thinking? When I worked in that first year, we opened the program for men who batter, and I was much too young and much too stupid, feminist at that time, and I'm still a feminist, but I'm not as stupid. And I was very stupid, and I bought into the men are the enemy kind of mantra, which was in the water in the 70s, to some extent. And I would go to these guys, and they would get court reported and referred, of course, like most of you who have these experiences. And they would sit there and listen to me yell at them for a year, and every week for 2 hours. And I felt good. They felt awful. They hated me. I hated them. We were not ever going to get married. However, one of the things I did do was a lot of therapy after that first year, and figured out that it was really hurt men that I was talking with, because I had been a hurt man myself. My anger towards them was my anger towards my father. My anger towards them were anger towards men who had sexually abused me as a kid. My anger towards them was anger towards the people that created the Vietnam War. It was like, oh my gosh, I've got somebody to dump on now, and they have to listen to me. I had a lot of work to do. they had a lot of work to do. The man who turned it around for me was in the group, in one of those early groups, and when the guys would come in, I wasn't all that awful. I was kind of friendly. But one of the guys that came in we'd always sort of said, so tell the group about your childhood. What was it like? As part of the process. And he said, well, my old man really knew how to take care of me because I was a bad kid. And I said, well, what did your father do to take care of you? He said, well, that sucker, if I started crying, if I was bad, when I could still fit, he would pick me up, put me in the oven, and close the oven door and tell me, you're going to stay there and I'm going to turn this sucker on if you don't stop crying. I listened to that story and I got chills. And I said, how was that for you?